The dawn bled slowly over the plains, a pale, bruised light stretching across the chilled sweep of land. Frost clung to the sagebrush like a thin veil, and the river, usually so certain in its course, moved sluggishly beneath a thin skin of ice. The cowboy rode along the bank with shoulders hunched, his breath rising in small ghosts before vanishing into the indifferent morning. His coat was worn thin at the elbows, stiff with dust and old sweat, and his bones ached the way they always did when sleep refused him. The world around him offered no warmth. Cottonwoods stood like gaunt sentinels stripped bare of forgiveness, their branches etched against the sky with a kind of quiet accusation. He felt it mirrored something hollow in his chest, something that had been scraped out over the long winter, ever since the loss that still pressed at him like a bruise that refused to fade. A man could ride for days out here and never touch anything softer than regret. His mare stopped first, ears pricked, head lowered. A faint sound drifted across the frozen air, thin, trembling, fragile as a bird's broken call. The cowboy straightened in the saddle, the stiffness in his back forgotten. Another sound followed. Then another. Not one voice. Manny. He nudged the mare closer, boots brushing against brittle grass, until he reached a bend in the river where the earth dipped low. There, clustered like a small wounded flock, were 8 children. 8 small figures wrapped in rags, some barefoot against the frost, some holding one another as though the act alone could keep the morning from swallowing them whole. Their cries were soft but relentless, the kind that throbbed in the air rather than cut through it. The cowboy dismounted slowly, as though fearing they would scatter like spooked quail. None moved. They only looked at him with the wide, glazed eyes of creatures pushed beyond fear into something quieter, something almost resigned. The oldest, a girl who might have been 12, though the sharpness of her cheeks made her seem older, lifted her chin with a stubbornness he recognized in himself. He swallowed hard. The river gurgled beside them, an unsteady breath in the cold. He crouched, the leather of his coat whispering. His voice came rough, the sound of a man unused to speaking after so many days on the trail. "Where's your people?" No one answered. The little ones shivered violently. One boy, small enough to fit under a single arm, kept rubbing his eyes, though no tears remained. The cowboy felt his throat tighten. The land had taken much from him already, but this gathering of abandoned souls felt like the final cruelty of a world that rarely showed mercy. He scanned the horizon. No tracks, no wagon, no sign of fire or shelter, just the endless sweep of winter-bitten prairie. Whoever had brought them here had left without looking back. The oldest girl finally spoke, her voice thin as the river ice. "They said they'd come back." The cowboy closed his eyes for the length of one breath. He knew the kind of lies adults told children when the truth was too heavy to carry. He had heard them himself in another lifetime. When he opened them again, he looked at the children, their raw-knuckled hands, their trembling lips, their threadbare layers, and something in him shifted, as if the cold inside cracked just enough to let in a dull ember of purpose. He did not have a plan. He barely had a home, just a weather-beaten ranch tucked into a hollow of land where the wind liked to rattle the boards loose. He lived quiet, spoke less, and carried his grief like another rider at his shoulder. But he could not leave them. He could not ride away and listen to their cries fade behind him. He rose and held out a hand to the oldest girl. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you warm." Her chin trembled, though she tried to hide it. After a long second she reached for him. When her small, cold fingers curled around his rough palm, something steadied in him. The others followed, hesitant at first, then desperate with relief. He lifted the smallest boy into his arms, feeling the child's breath shudder against his neck. The cowboy gathered them close and led them toward the mare, who shifted calmly as though understanding her burden had just grown a little heavier. He glanced once more at the empty horizon, its silence unforgiving. Then he turned his back on it. He had thought his heart too worn to carry anything more. But as 8 orphans clung to him beneath the rising sun, he realized he had been wrong. The trail home would be long, and the house colder than he wished. But for the first time in many months, the cowboy felt the faintest pull of something like purpose tugging at him, quiet, insistent, alive. The ranch stood at the edge of the prairie, huddled in a shallow hollow where the land tried and failed to shield itself from the wind. The wooden boards were sun-bleached and splintered, the porch sagging like an old man's back. A single window showed the weak glow of a lantern, its light stretched thin by the early gray of morning. Smoke drifted uncertainly from the chimney, carrying with it the faint, bitter tang of last season's wood. The cowboy led the children up the dirt path, their steps slow and clumsy. Each carried the stubborn silence of those who expected little and had received less. The youngest child pressed his face into the cowboy's shoulder, hiding from the world. The others walked behind in a line, their heads bowed, shoes scraping against frozen earth. He opened the battered door and let them shuffle in ahead of him. Inside, the house was spare. A stove squatting in the corner, the table marked by knife scars and burn rings, beds lined up against the wall, thin quilts folded neatly on top. The cowboy knelt and coaxed the stove to life, feeding it dry kindling and coaxing the fire with breath and patience. Slowly, the room filled with a reluctant warmth. The children gathered near, huddling around the stove as if they were worshiping a god they did not trust. Their faces softened in the glow, the sharp lines of hunger and cold giving way to something younger, more hopeful. He moved quietly through the house, ladling thin broth into tin cups, tearing bread into rough chunks. When he handed the food to the oldest girl, she hesitated, waiting, perhaps, for the world to take it back. The cowboy met her gaze, steady and plain, and offered a small nod. She distributed the food in silence, careful to give the smallest their share first. He watched them eat. Their hands shook, but no one spoke, not even when the warmth returned color to their cheeks. The youngest boy crawled beneath the table, curling up in a nest of old coats, eyes finally drifting shut. The others followed, one by one, to the beds, sinking into the thin comfort, with a relief that was nearly painful to witness. The cowboy stood by the window, arms folded, watching the prairie dawn break wider and colder. His mind drifted, unmoored. He remembered another winter, years past, when his wife's laughter had filled this room, when his own daughter had toddled across these same floorboards, fists full of wildflowers, eyes bright with promise. But the world had turned, and he had buried that laughter with the woman and the child who had once made this house a home. He had lived alone since then, speaking mostly to the mare or to the wind. Grief had become his only companion, a silent, loyal thing that never strayed far. Now, 8 small strangers filled his silence with their slow breaths and restless dreams. He let the memory of loss fill him, then forced himself to look away from it, back to the children. The oldest girl sat awake by the stove, knees drawn to her chest, staring into the fire as though it might reveal the world's secrets. He sat beside her, careful not to intrude. They sat in silence, 2 survivors adrift in the aftermath of hope. "You got a name?" he asked finally. His voice was softer than he meant, uncertain. She nodded. "I'm Sarah." He waited, and after a moment, she whispered the names of the others: Samuel, Lucy, Tom, Grace, Ben, Alice, little Henry. Each name spoken softly, a promise that they were real, that someone remembered. He repeated the names to himself, anchoring them in his mind. Then he reached for the old tin coffee pot, poured 2 cups, one for himself, one for Sarah. The wind rattled the window, but the warmth inside was real, alive. He did not smile, but something in his chest loosened. For the first time in years, the house felt less empty. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight they would rest. Stay with us for more tales where mercy defies the rope and love outlives the law. Subscribe now. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as fragile as frost. The winter sun barely climbed above the horizon, painting the land in washed-out golds and silvers. But within the walls of the ranch, life insisted itself in small, persistent ways. Sarah took to waking before dawn, the quiet of the house broken only by the sound of her feet on the kitchen planks. She would coax the embers in the stove to life, careful and deliberate, her movements shaped by the memory of hunger. The others clung to her, drawn by a gravity that had nothing to do with blood. Lucy's hand twined through Sarah's coat, Tom pressing close, Samuel learning to fetch water from the creek even when the ice bit through his boots. The cowboy watched them with a guarded heart. He moved through the house with an awkward gentleness, unsure of the boundaries between kindness and intrusion. Sometimes he found himself standing in the doorway, listening to the sounds of breathing, the shuffling of feet, the occasional burst of laughter when Grace made a face or Ben told a story from some brighter time. These were not his children, but their presence filled the long silence that had grown in him like a shadow. Work needed doing, and soon enough, he set about teaching them what he could. Sarah helped mend the quilts, her fingers quick and neat. The boys learned to stack wood, to sweep the floor, to gather eggs from the stubborn hens that pecked and muttered in the cold. Even little Henry, with his wide eyes and slow steps, wanted to help, lugging pieces of kindling twice his size, stubborn in his purpose. Sometimes, at the edge of day, the cowboy would ride out with Samuel and Tom, the three of them silent in the saddle, breath fogging in the cold air. The land opened around them, endless and unyielding. It tested a man's spirit, chipped at him until only what mattered remained. He watched the boys learn to read the signs in the snow, to follow a trail, to keep the fire burning even when the wind threatened to snatch it away. Nights were hardest. The children's dreams were uneasy, haunted by whatever had left them alone beside that river. Sarah often woke with a gasp, clutching at the edge of the blanket. The cowboy would sit by the stove, watching the coals pulse, knowing that nothing he could say would fill the hollow left by those who were gone. He remembered too well the shape of that emptiness. But slowly, without anyone meaning for it to happen, something began to shift. There were small mercies. Lucy's laughter, bright and sudden, Ben drawing pictures in the frost on the window, Grace braiding scraps of cloth into a doll for Alice. The house grew warmer, bit by bit, as though hope was something that could seep into wood and stone. He found himself talking more small things at first, stories of the land, of storms weathered, of horses won and lost. Sarah listened with eyes dark and steady, sometimes asking questions, sometimes only nodding. She was wary, but not unkind. One evening, as the light faded and the wind rattled the boards, she sat beside him on the porch. Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the hush. "Do you think they'll come back?" He answered with what truth he could find. "Sometimes the world takes more than it gives. But out here, what we have is each other." She nodded, the set of her jaw softening. For a moment, neither spoke. The stars crept out, indifferent and eternal. Inside, the laughter of the others drifted through the cracks, warm and real. The thaw came slow that year. Snow melted in reluctant rivulets down the rutted trail, mud swallowing the tracks of boots and hooves. The prairie grasses struggled to raise their heads, color returning in shy, uncertain threads. The wind, though still raw, carried the scent of distant rain and something green pressing up from underneath all that cold. The children grew braver with each passing day, testing the edges of this new life. They chased one another through the yard, invented games with sticks and stones, climbed the split-rail fence until the cowboy threatened to tie them to it if they broke another post. Even then, his voice was more gruff than angry, and the threat never landed. Sometimes a smile tugged at his mouth before he turned away. Sarah learned to ride, though she was nervous at first. The mare, patient and broad-backed, seemed to sense her caution and moved slow as syrup under the girl's careful hand. The cowboy showed her how to sit straight, to hold the reins gentle but sure, to trust the animal beneath her. Her first ride ended with dust on her skirt and a bruise on her knee, but her laughter, surprised and bright, carried far across the fields. In the barn, Tom and Samuel cleaned stalls, their hands blistered but proud. Grace took to shadowing the cowboy as he mended a gate or repaired a broken wheel. She listened to his instructions, her brow furrowed, eager to understand. The others tended chickens, swept the porch, gathered wild onions from the creek bank when the ground finally gave up its frost. At first, the cowboy did not know what to do with all this noise and motion. He kept to his routines early mornings, the smell of coffee on the stove, a few quiet moments before the day's demands began. Yet everywhere he turned, there was a child in his path. Lucy needed a splinter removed. Ben wanted to know the names of every bird. Alice crept into the kitchen before dawn, hopeful for a taste of batter before the bread was baked. Henry, the youngest, clung to his leg until he relented and swung the boy up onto his shoulders, the child's laughter warm against his ear. At night, when chores were finished and the lamps burned low, the cowboy sometimes found himself lingering by the beds. He would watch the children sleep tangled together, limbs thrown wide, faces finally smoothed by dreams. Something ached in him, slow and unfamiliar. He tried to remember if he had ever known such peace. Sometimes, in the dark, Sarah would whisper stories to the younger ones, bits of memory, scraps of old hope. The cowboy listened from the hallway, letting her voice knit the house together. He began to share pieces of himself as well, in ways that were not always words. He showed Sarah a silver coin, worn smooth by years in a pocket, the only thing his father had left him, pressed into his palm on a day when the world turned mean and uncertain. He told Tom and Samuel about the spring rains that would soon flood the river, about the wild horses that sometimes came down from the hills. He let the children see his loneliness, the cracks in his quiet. He watched them find their own ways of belonging. Grace sewed a button back on his shirt without being asked. Lucy made a wildflower crown for the mare. Alice and Ben planted seeds by the fence line, hopeful for blossoms. For all the hardship and sorrow that had brought them here, something new began to grow, slow as grass, sure as dawn. If this story echoes in your heart, subscribe and let the next one find you too. Spring brought with it not just new grass, but new worries. The river rose with the melt, turning the banks to slick mud and threatening the footbridge with every rainstorm. Supplies ran low faster with so many mouths to feed, and sometimes the cowboy stared at the dwindling sacks of flour and beans, feeling the weight of his choices settle into his shoulders like a saddle grown too heavy. Yet the ranch was no longer silent. The children's voices spilled through the days, sometimes laughter, sometimes squabbles, sometimes songs so old they might have been born in another country. Evenings, they gathered around the stove, hands and cheeks stained with work, and shared what small joys they could scrape together. A wild egg found in the grass, a frog caught at the river, a story remembered from a better time. Sarah watched over the others fiercely, her sense of responsibility etched deep by abandonment. But she let herself soften now, let herself be a child at odd moments, running barefoot after Lucy, or tumbling with Ben in the tall grass. She grew stronger, her face losing its hollowness, her eyes brightening with each day that the world did not betray her. The cowboy saw it all, pride and anxiety mingling in his heart. He set the children to chores, careful to balance duty and kindness. When Samuel grew frustrated with the plow or Alice wept over a broken doll, he was patient, his voice steady as river stones. At night, when he thought no one was watching, he mended their clothes by lamplight, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he stitched torn seams and patched elbows. Still, not everyone in town welcomed the change. Word traveled, as it always did. A stranger, Judge Hammond, with his wide-brimmed hat and cold gray eyes, arrived at the ranch one Sunday as clouds massed on the horizon. He dismounted without invitation, boots leaving deep prints in the thawed ground. The cowboy met him in the yard, the children watching from the porch. The judge's gaze swept over the house, the fields, the ragtag children, with suspicion sharpening his words. "You got a permit for all these?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice. The cowboy's jaw set. They were left at the river. No one's come for them. They got nowhere else. Hammond snorted. "Not your kin. Law's got a say in where children belong." Sarah stepped forward, defiant. The judge's gaze landed on her and lingered, cold and appraising. The cowboy put himself between them, his hand resting easy but unyielding at his side. "They belong here," he said, voice low but sure. Hammond's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." As the judge rode away, thunder rolled in the distance, the sound promising more than rain. The children gathered close, fear flickering in their eyes. That night, the house felt smaller, its warmth tempered by the knowledge that outside, the world waited, hungry to tear their fragile peace apart. But the cowboy drew them in, his arms wide, his words a rough promise. "This is your home," he said, voice thick. "Long as I'm able, no one's sending you away." Sarah's hand found his, small and certain. The other children pressed close. Outside, the rain battered the windows, but inside, they held tight to one another, determined to weather whatever storm might come. The storm battered the ranch for 3 days and nights, wind screeching across the prairie and rattling the walls like some hungry ghost. The river crested, swallowing the lower pasture, turning earth to black soup. For a time, It seemed the world outside had shrunk to nothing but rain and the low, constant groan of timbers. Inside, the house was a crowded ship adrift. Leaks sprang from the roof, puddles blooming on the floor. The children did what they could, catching water in tin pans, bundling rags into gaps under the door, mopping and wringing, shivering but determined. The cowboy moved from task to task with dogged patience, jaw set, shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. They took their meals by the glow of the stove, sharing bread and beans, stories and silence. At night, the children curled together like a litter of pups, and Sarah sat up late by the fire, her gaze steady and unafraid. The cowboy caught her watching him sometimes, as if measuring his strength or searching his face for the thing that might finally break him. When at last the clouds broke, the world emerged, changed. The fields were scarred with runnels, the bridge listing at a drunken angle, but the house still stood. The children stumbled out into pale sunlight, blinking, breathing deep as though they had been held under water too long. It was then, in the aftermath, that the true test arrived. Judge Hammond returned, this time with 2 men from town and a wagon painted with the county seal. They came up the lane with official slowness, their boots clean, their eyes flat. The children gathered on the porch, silent. Sarah pressed tight to the cowboy's side. Hammond spoke loud enough for all to hear. "We've orders from the court. These children are to come with us. Homes will be found for them, real homes, not this shack at the end of the world." The cowboy said nothing at first. He stared at the men, the sun behind his head, casting his face in shadow. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then he spoke, and though his voice was low, it carried clear as a bell. "They are home." Hammond shook his head. "You're not their father. You got no claim." Sarah stepped forward, her chin lifted, voice trembling but fierce. "He saved us. He didn't have to. He took us in when no one else would." Grace and Ben moved to stand beside her, their hands finding hers, their faces pale but steady. One by one, the others joined, until all 8 children stood as one. The cowboy's eyes burned, but he would not look away. "You want to take them? You'll have to go through me." The standoff hung in the morning air, heavy as thunder. One of the men shifted, uncertainty creasing his brow. Hammond glanced from the children to the cowboy, reading something there, determination, maybe, or the kind of hurt that has turned to iron over time. A voice came from behind a neighbor, Mrs. Pearson, drawn by the commotion. She spoke up, voice ringing with authority born of a lifetime on this land. "They belong here. You know it. Every soul in this county knows what he's done for them." Another neighbor appeared, and another. Soon, the yard filled with people, some quiet, some gruff, all unwilling to let the law tear apart what had become, in its own rough way, a family. Hammond's face soured. "This isn't the end," he said, but his words rang hollow. He turned his horse, his men following, the wagon's wheels catching in the mud. As they disappeared down the road, Sarah let out a shaky breath. The cowboy knelt, opening his arms, and the children rushed to him in a tangle of limbs and tears. The storm had passed, but their battle was not over. Yet, for that moment, under the clearing sky, they stood together stronger than they'd ever been. A family formed not by blood, but by choice. That spring, the prairie bloomed with an unexpected tenderness. Wildflowers sprang up where the floodwaters had receded, purple asters, golden sunflowers, the delicate white of prairie phlox. The land was scarred and battered, but stubborn, alive. Life persisted, sending roots deep into ruined ground. The children changed with the season. Where once they'd moved like shadows, they now ran bold and wild, bare feet slapping the new grass. Sarah's laughter led the others, high and clear, no longer just a shield but something genuine and bright. She learned to braid her own hair, taught Lucy to fish with a willow rod, showed Ben how to mend a torn shirt. Samuel and Tom chased each other through the fields, learning to wrestle and to forgive. Even little Henry, whose voice had been no more than a whisper when he first arrived, now sang as he played in the dirt with Alice, their games full of made-up rules and wild imaginings. The cowboy worked with them, building, mending, teaching. He showed Tom how to set a fence post straight, how to sharpen a blade until it would shave a strand of hair. With Sarah, he spent long afternoons tending the garden, turning earth rich and dark. her hands beside his in the soil. The rhythm of days steadied him. The ache in his heart did not fade, but changed shape, growing room for something new. He let himself remember sometimes, when the house was quiet and dusk pressed against the windows, the weight of his wife's hand in his, the sound of his daughter's laughter. But grief loosened its hold. Where emptiness had been, the children's voices now echoed, filling the gaps. One evening, as the sun poured gold across the yard, the cowboy sat on the steps and watched the children catch fireflies. Grace cupped a flickering spark in her hands, her face alight with wonder. Sarah sat beside him, knees hugged to her chest, silent but content. He spoke without looking at her, his voice rough but honest. "Never thought I'd see a house full again." She rested her head on his shoulder, the gesture shy but certain. "It's a good house," she whispered. "Better than any I can remember." Inside, Ben played a tune on a mouth harp, the sound sweet and off-key, joined by Lucy's offhand humming. Tom and Samuel argued over whose turn it was to feed the horses, their quarrel ending in laughter. The old ranch, for so long a mausoleum, pulsed with new life. Later that night, after the children had drifted to sleep, Sarah lingered by the doorway. "Do you think we'll stay?" she asked quietly, the question too big for her years. The cowboy crouched beside her, meeting her gaze head-on. "Long as you want," he said, the promise clear. "This is home, if you'll have it." She smiled, a real smile, brave and wide. "We'll have it," she said. Then she stepped into the dark, trusting the way to bed. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass, soft and constant. The cowboy stood for a long time, the lamp's glow behind him, the hush of the house at his back. Hope, once lost, had returned, as quiet and unstoppable as dawn. Summer arrived in a hush of heat and thunder, sky pale as bleached bone and wide enough to swallow any sorrow. The prairie shimmered under the weight of sunlight, cicadas droning in the stillness, grasshoppers vaulting from blade to blade. The house filled with the sense of bread rising, of sweat and leather, of children who lived hard and loud and without apology. The work never ended. Days began before the sun, with buckets and boots and chores handed out in sleepy voices. The children learned the rhythm, milking the cow, fetching water, collecting eggs warm from the hen. Ben made a game of it, racing Lucy to the barn each morning, the loser tasked with mucking the stalls. Grace and Alice scoured the creek banks for berries, faces stained with purple and red. Tom and Samuel became inseparable, building forts in the hayloft, carving their names into the beams with pocket knives the cowboy had entrusted to them on a day he felt especially hopeful. Sarah proved herself most of all. She worked beside the cowboy in the fields, turning hay with a pitchfork nearly as tall as she was, wiping sweat from her brow. Her hands blistered but uncomplaining. She grew taller, her hair sun-bleached, her eyes sharp and steady. When storms gathered on the horizon, she was the one to call the children inside, to bar the doors, to set the lamp in the window so the cowboy would find his way back from the far pasture. With each passing week, trust stitched itself between them, something as invisible as breath, but as strong as the roots beneath the prairie. They grew into a family in fits and starts, awkward and tender, stitched together by days of labor and nights of story and song. The cowboy learned to listen, to let the children's worries surface. Lucy's nightmares, Samuel's doubts, Sarah's memories of promises broken. He answered not with speeches, but with presence, his hand on a shoulder, a nod of understanding, a place at his table that was never questioned. But peace on the frontier was a fragile thing, and whispers still drifted from town, rumors of men who thought the ranch too wild, too unruly, too far from the way things were meant to be. The cowboy heard these things and kept his counsel, but his guard never dropped. He taught the children to stand together, to protect what was theirs, to give kindness when they could but never yield their place in the world. One August dusk, as the first cool breeze hinted at autumn, Sarah found the cowboy at the fence line, mending a break in the wire. She stood beside him, silent, watching the way his hands moved, steady, certain, careful. "Thank you," she said at last, voice small in the wide hush. He looked at her, saw the girl she was and the woman she might become, saw the courage and the hunger for belonging. "You saved me too, you know," he said, the admission costing him nothing and everything. She smiled, blinking fast, then reached out to help twist the wire tight. They worked in silence until the stars rose. The prairie stretched endless before them, wild and waiting, and for the first time, neither felt alone. When autumn swept across the land, it did so with a hush that felt almost reverent. Gold and rust spilled through the cottonwoods, the fields a patchwork of fading green and brittle brown. The wind turned sharp and sweet, and the nights grew long, drawing the children closer around the stove, their faces bathed in flickering light. Harvest became their daily labor and celebration. Samuel and Tom hauled sheaves of wheat, shoulders straining, boots caked with mud. Grace and Lucy learned to peel apples with a single curling strip, laughter bright as the fruit's pale flesh. Sarah worked alongside the cowboy, her back strong, her arms sure, the memory of hunger still driving her, but softened now by belonging. The cowboy found comfort in this season. The sharp ache of grief dulled, replaced by the sweet exhaustion of honest work and the daily evidence of growth. Children taller by inches, braver by the week, their voices ringing out with certainty. At night, he sometimes lingered at the edge of their small circle, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, listening as Ben recited lines of a poem Sarah had taught him, or as Alice tried often in vain to tune the battered fiddle rescued from the attic. But peace did not mean the world had forgotten them. Judge Hammond's threats lingered, a shadow never far from the porch. The cowboy kept an eye on the road, always expecting the crunch of tires or the hard voice at the gate. He worried, quietly, about the thinness of the stores, about the cattle, about the future he had staked everything to build. Still, the children learned to trust in the rhythm of home, in the ways the cowboy's word was a kind of shelter. They grew sure enough to dream. Ben announced one day that he would be a doctor, and Lucy said she wanted to write stories. Tom and Samuel planned to build a windmill on the rise, sketching their ideas in the dust with sticks. Sarah, who had once expected nothing but disappointment, spoke of staying on the ranch forever, her eyes steady, her voice full of quiet hope. Then, one morning as the first frost rimmed the windows, a letter arrived, heavy paper, the seal broken, words written in a careful hand. The children watched as the cowboy read it at the kitchen table, the lines deepening at his mouth and brow. The letter bore news, a final summons to court, the children's fate to be decided once and for all. Fear crept back into the house, old and cold. The children grew quiet, shadows returning to their faces. Sarah sat at the table late into the night, staring into the empty hearth, her hands clenched white. The cowboy watched her, his own doubts a storm beneath his ribs. But he spoke gently, steady as the earth. "No one's taking you without a fight," he promised, the words heavy with the full truth of his heart. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "We'll fight too," she whispered. Together, they braced for the coming test. The house, worn and weathered, stood ready a bulwark against the winds of fate. And inside, their hope burned bright as a lantern in the dark, unwavering. The day of the hearing arrived with a cold, cutting wind. The cowboy rose before dawn, washed and dressed in his best shirt, the one with buttons polished by years of use. He laid out clothes for each child, patched and faded but clean. Sarah helped the younger ones, braiding Lucy's hair, fastening Ben's collar, wiping nervous tears from Henry's cheeks. The journey into town was silent but close, the wagon creaking beneath their weight. The landscape slipped by in bands of gray and gold, trees stripped bare, and fields lying fallow. The cowboy kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched, but his hand never left the reins, steady, reassuring. At the courthouse, they were met by stares, some curious, some cold, some quietly supportive. Neighbors nodded to them, tipping hats, murmuring encouragement as they filed through the doors. The courtroom was a box of dust and light, every sound amplified. Boots on floorboards, the shuffling of papers, the scratch of Judge Hammond's pen. The children sat together on the front bench, hands clasped tight. The cowboy stood behind them, his figure broad and unyielding. Sarah's back was straight, her chin lifted in silent challenge. When Hammond entered, silence dropped like a stone. The judge read the charges: abandonment, lack of kin, questions of fitness and law. His eyes, gray and sharp, fell on the cowboy, then swept over the children. "What claim do you have on these orphans?" he demanded, voice echoing in the quiet. The cowboy spoke softly, but every word carried. "No blood claim, only the claim of a man who found 8 children in the cold and brought them home. I gave them shelter, work, and a family. I gave them what I had left." Hammond's gaze was skeptical, mouth drawn thin. "Charity is not enough. The law asks more." Sarah stood then, voice clear as glass. "We chose him. He chose us. He's the only father we've had. We work the land. We help each other. We belong." One by one, the children added their voices, stumbling sometimes, but determined. Ben told of learning to read by lamplight. Grace spoke of tending the garden. Tom and Samuel spoke of fixing fences and running the fields. Even Alice and Henry managed soft words, clutching each other's hands for courage. A hush fell. The judge's eyes flicked from the cowboy to the children, lingering a moment on Sarah's fierce composure. He called for witnesses, and neighbors spoke up. Mrs. Pearson, old Mr. Conroy, the preacher's wife. They told of kindness, of long days and hard work, of a house that had turned from sorrow to laughter. For a long time, Hammond said nothing. The ticking of the clock was a thunder in the stillness. At last he spoke, words measured, heavy with the weight of finality. "You have built something here, against the odds. The law was made to protect children. Sometimes it must listen to their hearts as well as their blood. This court finds that these children may remain under the care of the man who took them in, so long as he remains worthy." A sound like breath released swept through the room. The children surged from the bench, arms thrown around the cowboy, laughter and tears tumbling together. The townsfolk clapped backs, tipped hats, offered blessings. Outside, the wind had softened, the sun bright on the courthouse steps. The cowboy stood with his new family, their future uncertain, but their bond affirmed. Sarah took his hand, the gesture small, indelible. For a moment, the world seemed wide with promise. They rode home together beneath a sky awash, with the gold of late afternoon, the prairie stretching wide and forgiving. The wind, gentler now, lifted the dust behind their wagon in a long, twisting ribbon. There was a hush in the air, as though the land itself had paused to listen to their laughter, their stories, the sound of hope finally breaking free after so many silent years. Back at the ranch, the house stood waiting, sun-warmed and battered but steadfast. The children spilled from the wagon, racing through the grass, shouting names and promises, their fears left behind with the courthouse shadows. Sarah walked at the cowboy's side, her hand tight in his, her smile unguarded for the first time since the river. The work resumed the old rhythms, now tinged with celebration. Ben and Grace baked a lopsided pie with last year's apples, flour dusted across their noses. Tom and Samuel mended the chicken coop, driving each nail with pride, pausing to laugh when Lucy and Alice scattered the hens in a wild chase. Henry trailed after the cowboy, mimicking each gesture, determined to learn how to check a saddle, how to read the sky for weather. That evening, they gathered for supper beneath the wide, lantern-lit porch. The cowboy sat at the head of the table, his voice steady as he led a short grace, his eyes lingering on each child, each miracle, each hard-won piece of joy. Sarah served the pie, her hands sure, her heart easy in her chest. After the meal, the children offered gifts, a wildflower crown, a hand-stitched kerchief, a painted stone. Simple things, tokens of gratitude and belonging. Sarah pressed a folded scrap of paper into the cowboy's hand, a drawing of the ranch, the house and barn. 8 small figures, and one tall one at the center, arms open wide. He swallowed hard, pride and sorrow tangled together, and reached for her. She let herself be held, as did the others. A family gathered in a circle of arms, laughter and warmth. The prairie darkened, the sky scattered with stars, and from the porch their voices rose, singing, storytelling, dreaming together beneath that endless western sky. In the days that followed, life settled into a new peace. The children grew into their chores, into their home, into themselves. The cowboy's solitude became a memory and ache still, but no longer empty. He found purpose in teaching, in listening, in the small, patient work of building a family not by blood but by choice. And in quiet moments, he would stand at the door, watching the land he had fought to keep, watching the children race through fields alive with grass and memory. He understood at last what it meant to endure, not just to survive loss, but to gather what remained and build something lasting from it. As the prairie wind sang soft in the eaves, the house glowed with promise, a lantern on the plains, a sanctuary against darkness. Here, love had taken root in worn hands and hopeful hearts. Here, nothing and no one would be left behind.